I used to think if I just stayed quieter about my pain, complained less about my discomfort, and pushed through whatever my body was telling me, maybe my family would finally see me as strong instead of weak, capable instead of fragile. But no matter how much agony I endured in silence, or how many times I minimized my own suffering, in the Patterson household, my sister Natalie's reputation would always matter more than my well-being. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Harmony Patterson, and growing up in the mountain town of Cedar Ridge meant living in a family where athletic achievement was everything, and where my older sister's Olympic dreams cast a shadow so long that my own pain literally became invisible. The Patterson family lived in a sprawling ranch house on Timber Creek Drive, nestled against the foothills where winter sports dominated our community's identity. My father, William, worked as the head coach for Cedar Ridge High School ski team, a position that made him something of a local celebrity and gave him strong opinions about toughness, dedication, and playing through pain. My mother, Janet, managed the household while working part-time as a physical therapist, though her professional understanding of injuries seemed to disappear when it came to evaluating her own daughters. Natalie was 3 years older than me, and from the time she could walk, she was destined for greatness on the slopes. At 19, she was ranked among the top junior alpine skiers in the country, with genuine prospects for making the Olympic team within the next few years. To our parents, Natalie was their golden ticket to living vicariously through elite athletic success. To me, she was the hurricane whose path of destruction I was constantly caught in. The favoritism in our family wasn't just about attention or resources. It was about whose physical well-being mattered when push came to shove. When Natalie complained of knee soreness, Dad would immediately schedule appointments with sports medicine specialists and shell out hundreds of dollars for massage therapy and advanced treatments. When I mentioned persistent back pain from a fall I'd taken while hiking, Dad's response was always the same. Toughen up, Harmony. Pain is temporary, but giving up lasts forever. Natalie could miss school for training camps, physical therapy appointments, and recovery days without anyone questioning her commitment to education. When I asked to stay home due to a severe migraine that had me vomiting and unable to focus, I was told that real athletes don't let pain control their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Within seconds, both parents were rushing into my room, taking in the scene. Me curled on the floor, clearly in severe distress, and Natalie standing over me with tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" Dad demanded. "We were arguing about my race bib, and I pushed her, and she fell into the bed frame," Natalie sobbed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just so stressed about the competition." Mom knelt down beside me, her physical therapy training finally kicking in. "Harmony, can you tell me where it hurts?" "My hip," I managed to gasp. I can't move." Mom gently examined the area, and I could see concern growing on her face as she felt around my pelvis. "William, we need to take her to the emergency room. This could be serious." But Dad's response shocked me to my core. "Let's not overreact," he said, his voice measured and calm. "Natalie's got her big race next weekend. We can't have any family drama or distractions right now. William, she can't move. Look at her, she's in severe pain." Pain doesn't always mean serious injury. Remember when Natalie thought she'd torn her ACL last year? It turned out to be minor inflammation. Harmony's probably just bruised. I stared at my father in disbelief. I was lying on my bedroom floor, unable to stand or even shift my position with excruciating pain, and his primary concern was protecting Natalie from drama before her race. "Dad, please," I whispered. "Something's really wrong. I've never felt anything like this." Harmony, I know it hurts, but you need to stay strong. Sometimes the body sends pain signals that are worse than the actual injury. Give it a few hours and you'll probably feel much better. A few hours? Mom's voice was incredulous. William, as a physical therapist, I'm telling you this needs medical evaluation. And as someone who's coached athletes for 20 years, I'm telling you that we need to be smart about this. If we rush to the ER every time someone gets bumped around, we'll be there every week. The argument that followed was surreal. I lay on my bedroom floor, unable to move without crying out in pain, while my parents debated whether my injury warranted medical attention. Meanwhile, Natalie sat in the corner, oscillating between guilt over what she'd done and anxiety about how this might affect her upcoming race. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, Mom won the argument by threatening to take me to the hospital herself if Dad didn't agree to come along. Fine, Dad said tersely, but we're going to urgent care, not the ER. And Natalie, you stay here and rest. You need to keep your mind focused on your race preparation. The ride to Cedar Ridge urgent care was a nightmare. Every bump in the road sent fresh waves of agony through my pelvis, and I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. Dad kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror with an expression that seemed more annoyed than concerned. Try to stay calm, Harmony. The calmer you are, the better you'll be able to think through the pain. I wanted to scream that I wasn't choosing to be in pain, that I wasn't being dramatic or weak, that something was genuinely wrong with my body. But I'd been trained by years of family dynamics to minimize my own suffering, to accept that my pain was less important than Natalie's needs and Dad's convenience. The urgent care waiting room was crowded with typical weekend injuries. Kids with possible broken arms, adults with flu symptoms, elderly patients with various complaints. We waited for 2 hours before a nurse finally called my name. During those 2 hours, I noticed something that would haunt me for months afterward. Dad spent most of the time on his phone, texting with Natalie's coach about training schedules and discussing race strategy. When other families in the waiting room tried to make sympathetic conversation about my obvious distress, Dad would smile and say things like, "Kids, you know, they're tougher than they think." He was treating my potentially serious injury as an inconvenience that was interfering with more important athletic priorities. When we finally saw Dr. Martinez at the urgent care clinic, his examination was thorough but limited by the facility's capabilities. He noted significant tenderness around my pelvis, restricted range of motion, and my obvious pain response to any attempted movement. "I'm concerned about the mechanism of injury and the level of pain she's experiencing," Dr. Martinez told my parents. "A direct impact to the pelvis at this angle could potentially cause fractures or other serious damage." "Could potentially," Dad repeated, latching on to the uncertainty. "So, you're not sure there's actually an injury?" "Mr. Patterson, pain like this after a trauma is concerning regardless of what shows up on initial examination. I'd recommend getting x-rays to rule out fractures and possibly an MRI if the x-rays don't show clear answers." "How long would all that testing take?" "The x-rays can be done today, but MRI scheduling might take a few days or a week." I could see Dad doing calculations in his head, weighing the time and expense of proper diagnosis against Natalie's race schedule. "Let's start with x-rays and see what they show. If it's obviously broken, we'll deal with it. If not, we'll manage the pain at home and see how she feels in a few days." Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable with this approach, but couldn't force us to pursue more aggressive testing. The x-rays were taken, showing what the radiologist described as possible hairline fractures that were difficult to definitively identify on the images. "Possible fractures means we should investigate further," Dr. Martinez recommended. "The pelvis is a complex structure, and missed fractures can have serious long-term consequences."
"Or possible fractures could mean there are no fractures at all," Dad countered. "Look, doctor, I appreciate your thoroughness, but my daughter is an athlete. She's experienced pain before, and she knows the difference between serious injury and temporary discomfort. I wanted to protest that I wasn't an athlete like Natalie, that I had no experience with serious sports injuries, and that this pain was unlike anything I'd ever felt. but I'd been conditioned to defer to Dad's judgment about these things, especially when medical professionals were being overcautious. We left urgent care with a prescription for pain medication, instructions to rest, and a recommendation to follow up if symptoms worsened. Dad seemed satisfied that he'd been proven right about not overreacting to my injury. But as the days passed, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. The pain didn't improve. If anything, it got worse. I couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't sleep through the night, and couldn't walk more than a few steps without sharp, shooting pains through my pelvis and legs. Simple activities like getting dressed or using the bathroom became exercises in endurance. Meanwhile, the family's focus remained laser-focused on Natalie's upcoming race. Dad spent hours reviewing video footage of her training runs. Mom helped her pack and repack her competition gear. The house buzzed with nervous energy and excitement about what could be a breakthrough performance for Natalie's Olympic aspirations. My ongoing pain became background noise to their preparations. "How are you feeling, honey?" Mom would ask each morning, but her attention was clearly divided between my answer and whatever Natalie needed for her training schedule. "Still hurting," I'd reply, and she'd nod sympathetically while already moving on to discuss Natalie's nutrition plan or warm-up routine. When I asked if we could follow up with Dr. Martinez or get the additional testing he'd recommended, Dad's response was always the same. "Let's see how you feel after Natalie's race. We don't want any distractions right now." The message was clear. My pain was a distraction from the family's real priorities. 3 days before Natalie's competition, I woke up in the middle of the night with pain so severe that I couldn't stifle my cries. Mom found me in the bathroom, doubled over and barely able to stand. "This isn't normal," she said, her professional instincts finally overriding family politics. "William, we need to take her back to the doctor." "Janet, it's the middle of the night. If it were a real emergency, she would have woken up screaming. She's probably just having a bad pain day." "She did wake up in distress. Look at her. Something is wrong." Dad appeared in the bathroom doorway, taking in the scene with obvious frustration. "Harmony, I need you to be honest with me. Are you exaggerating this pain because you're upset about Natalie getting attention for her race?" The question hit me like a physical blow. After days of suffering in relative silence, minimizing my symptoms to avoid being labeled as dramatic, my own father was suggesting that I was fabricating or exaggerating my pain for attention. "Dad, I would never," I started, but he cut me off. "I'm not saying you're doing it on purpose, but sometimes when people feel overlooked, they unconsciously amplify their symptoms to get care and attention." "William, that's not what's happening here," Mom said firmly. "This is legitimate pain from a legitimate injury." "Then why didn't the x-rays show anything definitive? Why did the doctor say it was only possible fractures?" "Because some fractures don't show up clearly on initial x-rays. That's why he recommended additional testing." Additional testing that costs thousands of dollars and could distract from Natalie's preparation for the most important race of her career so far. The cost-benefit analysis of my pain versus Natalie's athletic career was being calculated right in front of me, and I was losing. That's when I understood something fundamental about my place in this family. I wasn't just the non-athletic daughter. I was the expendable one. My suffering was acceptable if it served the greater good of Natalie's success. My pain was manageable if it meant maintaining focus on what really mattered. But lying in that bathroom, unable to find any position that didn't cause agony, I also understood that I couldn't rely on my family to advocate for my well-being. If I was going to get proper medical care, I'd have to find a way to fight for it myself. I just had no idea that my salvation would come from an unexpected source, and that one radiologist's professional integrity would change the trajectory of my entire life. The week leading up to Natalie's race was a masterclass in family dysfunction disguised as athletic dedication.
While I struggled with increasing pain and mobility issues, our household transformed into a high-performance training camp where my suffering became an inconvenient sidebar to the main event. Dad had taken time off work to focus entirely on Natalie's preparation. He'd arranged for a sports psychologist to work with her on visualization techniques, hired a massage therapist to come to the house daily, and even brought in a nutritionist to optimize her pre-race meals. Every conversation in our house revolved around Natalie's equipment, her mental state, her strategy for each section of the race course. Meanwhile, I was rationing the pain medication Dr. Martinez had prescribed because nobody had discussed refills or follow-up care. The pills helped somewhat, but they made me drowsy and unable to think clearly, which meant I was falling behind on schoolwork while trying to manage pain that seemed to be getting worse rather than better. "How was Harmony doing with her injury?" I heard Mom ask Dad one evening as I lay on the couch, unable to find a comfortable position. "She's managing," Dad replied without looking away from the race footage he was reviewing with Natalie. "Kids are resilient. She'll be fine."
The casual dismissal of my ongoing distress was becoming a pattern. When I mentioned that sitting through classes was becoming unbearable, Dad suggested I was using my injury as an excuse to avoid academic challenges. When I asked if we could schedule the follow-up MRI that Dr. Martinez had recommended, Dad said we'd discuss it after Natalie's race when things calmed down. But things weren't calming down. If anything, the pressure in our household was building toward Natalie's competition like a pressure cooker about to explode. 3 days before the race, Natalie had what she called a breakthrough training run, a practice session where everything clicked perfectly and her times were better than they'd been all season. Dad was ecstatic, calling relatives and Natalie's coach to share the news, the living room filled with celebration and optimism about what this might mean for her performance. I was happy for my sister, genuinely. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't want her to fail. But watching the family celebration from my position on the couch, unable to participate because standing for more than a few minutes triggered shooting pains through my pelvis, I felt more isolated than ever. "This could be it," Dad was saying to someone on the phone. "This could be the race that gets her noticed by the Olympic development team." "Harmony, isn't this exciting?" Mom asked, turning to include me in the conversation. "Natalie might finally get the recognition she deserves." "It's great," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm really proud of her." But inside, I was thinking about how my own need for recognition, for my pain to be taken seriously, for my injury to receive proper medical attention, had been completely overshadowed by Natalie's athletic ambitions. The breaking point came 2 days before Natalie's race. I'd been struggling to sleep for over a week, unable to find any position that didn't aggravate my hip pain. The prescription medication helped during the day, but at night, when I was lying still, the pain seemed to intensify. I'd taken to sleeping on the living room couch with pillows strategically positioned to support my body, but even that was becoming insufficient. It was 3 a.m. when the pain became so severe that I couldn't suppress my cries. I'd been lying awake for hours, shifting constantly and trying not to wake anyone, when a sudden movement triggered what felt like lightning shooting through my entire lower body. I must have called out louder than I realized, but within minutes, the entire family was gathered in the living room. Mom was kneeling beside the couch in her bathrobe, Dad was standing nearby in his pajamas looking irritated about being woken up, and Natalie was hovering by the stairs in obvious distress. "What's wrong?" Mom asked, shifting into her physical therapy assessment mode. "Is it worse than usual?" "Something's different," I gasped. "It feels like something shifted or moved wrong. The pain is different from before." Mom gently examined my hip area, and I could see concern growing on her face. "William, her pelvis feels unstable. I think there might be displacement or separation that wasn't there before." "Displacement of what? The X-rays didn't show any fractures." "The X-rays showed possible fractures that needed further investigation," Mom corrected. "And if there are fractures, they could be getting worse from lack of proper treatment. Or she could be having muscle spasms from lying in one position too long," Dad countered. "Athletes deal with this kind of pain all the time." "I'm not an athlete,"
I'm not Natalie. I don't have training in managing sports injuries, and I don't have experience with this level of pain." The room fell silent. It was the first time I directly challenged the assumption that I should handle my injury with the same stoicism expected from elite athletes. "Harmony," Dad said, his voice taking on the warning tone I knew meant I was crossing a line. "I understand you're uncomfortable, but you need to keep things in perspective." "What perspective? That my pain doesn't matter because it's inconvenient timing?" "Your pain matters, but so does your sister's preparation for the most important race of her career. We can't let family drama derail months of training." "Family drama?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Dad, I have a serious injury that hasn't been properly treated. This isn't drama. It's a medical emergency." "If it were a medical emergency, you'd be in the emergency room. You're in pain, I understand that. But you're not dying, and you're not going to die if we wait a few more days for proper evaluation." "How do you know that?" Mom interjected, her voice sharp. "William, as a medical professional, I'm telling you that untreated pelvic fractures can have serious complications. And as someone who's coached athletes for 20 years, I'm telling you that we can't panic every time someone has a bad pain day." "This isn't a bad pain day," I shouted, my frustration finally boiling over. "This is 2 weeks of agony that you keep dismissing because it interferes with Natalie's schedule." Natalie, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly burst into tears. "This is all my fault. I hurt her. And now everyone is fighting and my race is ruined because I can't focus with all this stress." Immediately, both parents' attention shifted to Natalie. Dad moved to comfort her, assuring her that she wasn't to blame and that everything would be fine. Mom looked torn between her daughter's emotional distress and her professional assessment of my injury. "Natalie, honey, accidents happen," Dad said soothingly. "This is not your fault, and we're not going to let it affect your performance." "But Harmony is in so much pain, and it's because of what I did. How can I race knowing I hurt my sister?" "Because the best thing you can do now is show that all your hard work and preparation weren't wasted," Dad replied. "Harmony will be fine, but this opportunity for you might not come again." I watched the scene with a mixture of heartbreak and clarity. Even in a moment that should have been about my medical needs, the conversation had pivoted to protecting Natalie's emotional state and preserving her race performance. My actual injury was secondary to managing how that injury affected Natalie's mental preparation.
"I need to go to the hospital," I said quietly, my voice cutting through their emotional huddle. "Tonight. Now." "Harmony, let's not be dramatic," Dad said without turning away from Natalie. "We'll call Dr. Martinez in the morning and see what he recommends." "No," I said, louder this time. "I'm not waiting until morning. I'm not waiting until after Natalie's race. I'm not waiting for your permission to get medical care for an injury that's been getting worse for 2 weeks." Dad finally turned to look at me, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "You're 17 years old. You don't get to make unilateral decisions about medical care." "Then make the decision," I challenged. "As my parent, decide whether my well-being is worth more than the convenience of Natalie's race schedule." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. In that moment, I could see Dad calculating the cost of disrupting Natalie's preparation against the risk of my injury being more serious than he'd acknowledged. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "But we're going to urgent care, not the ER. And Natalie, you're staying here to rest. You need to keep your mind focused on your race." "I want to come with you," Natalie said through her tears. "I need to make sure Harmony's okay." "Absolutely not," Dad replied firmly. "You have 2 days to maintain your mental preparation, and hospital visits are not part of that plan." As we prepared to leave for the second urgent care visit in 2 weeks, I realized something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my family dynamics. This wasn't just about Natalie being the favored daughter or Dad prioritizing athletic achievement.
This was about a systematic devaluation of my physical well-being in service of maintaining Natalie's competitive edge. The ride to Cedar Ridge urgent care at 4 a.m. was even more painful than the first trip, partly because my injury had worsened, and partly because I now understood how reluctantly this medical attention was being provided. "I hope you understand the position you're putting this family in," Dad said as we sat in the nearly empty waiting room. "If Natalie has a poor performance because she's distracted by family stress, that affects her entire future trajectory. And if I have permanent damage from an untreated injury, does that affect my future trajectory? You're 17 years old. You have plenty of time to recover from minor injuries. Natalie is at a critical point in her athletic career where timing matters." "How do you know this is a minor injury? You've been saying that for 2 weeks, but the pain keeps getting worse." "Because major injuries show up clearly on x-rays. If you had serious fractures, they would have been obvious. This circular logic that my injury couldn't be serious because it wasn't obviously serious, despite clear evidence that something was wrong, would have been frustrating under any circumstances. But sitting in an urgent care waiting room at 4 a.m., having fought for this basic medical attention, it felt like gaslighting. When we were finally called back to see Dr. Martinez again, his expression was troubled as soon as he saw me. "How has she been since the last visit?" he asked my parents. "Pain has been ongoing, maybe worse than before." "Has she been able to return to normal activities?" "Not really," I answered before my parents could respond. "I can't sit through classes, I can't sleep, and I can barely walk more than a few steps with sharp pain." Dr. Martinez examined me again, and this time his concern was more obvious. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I'm seeing signs that suggest possible displacement or progression of the injury. The range of motion is more limited than it was 2 weeks ago, and there's increased instability in the pelvic region." "What does that mean?" Dad asked. "It means that if there were hairline fractures that we couldn't see clearly on the initial x-rays, they may have gotten worse from continued activity and lack of proper immobilization." "So you're saying she does have fractures?" "I'm saying we need better imaging to determine the extent of the injury. At this point, I'd recommend an emergency CT scan and possibly an MRI to get a complete picture of what's happening." Dad's jaw tightened. "Emergency imaging means emergency room costs." "Mr. Patterson, untreated pelvic fractures can lead to long-term mobility issues, chronic pain, and complications with internal organs. The cost of proper treatment now is significantly less than the cost of dealing with permanent damage later." "But you said the original x-rays showed only possible fractures. If they were serious, wouldn't they have been definitive?" "Not necessarily. Some fractures, particularly stress fractures or hairline breaks in complex areas like the pelvis, can be very difficult to see on standard x-rays. That's why I recommended additional imaging 2 weeks ago." The weight of Dr. Martinez's words settled over the room. For 2 weeks, while our family had been focused on Natalie's race preparation, I'd potentially been walking around with untreated fractures that were getting worse from lack of proper care. "What are you recommending specifically?" Mom asked. "Emergency room evaluation with CT imaging, followed by orthopedic consultation tonight." Dad looked at his watch. It was nearly 5 a.m., 2 days before Natalie's race. "Doctor, I understand your concern, but is this truly an emergency that can't wait until next week?" Dr. Martinez stared at Dad for a long moment before responding. "Mr. Patterson, your daughter has been in significant pain for 2 weeks following a traumatic injury. She's showing signs of possible fracture displacement and increasing instability. If you were an athlete under my care, I would have insisted on comprehensive imaging immediately." The comparison to an athlete was deliberate, and it landed exactly as Dr. Martinez had intended. Even Dad couldn't argue that an athlete with these symptoms would be told to tough it out for 2 weeks.
"Fine," Dad said, his resignation clear. "But I want it noted that we're doing this against my better judgment about timing." As we prepared to leave urgent care for the emergency room, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Finally, I was going to get proper medical evaluation. But I also understood that this decision was being framed as an unreasonable demand that was disrupting more important family priorities. I had no idea that within hours, one radiologist's professional expertise would completely vindicate my weeks of pain and transform my understanding of what it meant to advocate for my own well-being. The emergency room at Cedar Ridge Regional Hospital was about to become the place where my family's carefully constructed narrative about my minor injury would be shattered by undeniable medical evidence. The emergency room at Cedar Ridge Regional Hospital at 5:30 a.m. was a different world from the urgent care clinic, where Dr. Martinez was thorough but limited by his facility's capabilities. The ER operated with the kind of systematic efficiency that comes from dealing with genuine medical emergencies around the clock. The triage nurse took one look at my obvious distress and the circumstances of my injury, 2 weeks of worsening pain following pelvic trauma, and immediately classified me as requiring urgent evaluation. Within 20 minutes, I was in a hospital bed being assessed by Dr. Rebecca Torres, the emergency physician on duty. Dr. Torres was probably in her 40s, with the kind of calm competence that inspired immediate confidence. She listened carefully as I described the original injury, the timeline of my symptoms, and the previous medical care I'd received. "Who was the physician who saw you at urgent care?" she asked, making notes in my chart. "Dr. Martinez. He recommended additional imaging, but..." I glanced at Dad, who was sitting stiffly in the corner chair. "But we wanted to see how she progressed before committing to expensive testing," Dad finished. "The initial x-rays were inconclusive." Dr. Torres nodded without judgment, but I could see her making mental notes about the delay in care. "Let me examine you, and then we'll get some better pictures of what's going on." Her physical examination was more thorough than anything I'd received before. She tested my range of motion, checked for nerve function in my legs, and palpated areas around my pelvis with careful precision. Several times during the exam, she paused to make additional notes, her expression growing more serious. "Harmony, I'm seeing several concerning signs that suggest significant pelvic injury," she said when she finished. "The good news is that your nerve function appears intact, which means we're not dealing with spinal cord involvement. But I'm definitely worried about fractures that may have been missed or that have progressed." "What kind of fractures?" Mom asked, her physical therapy background making her more informed than most parents. "Based on the mechanism of injury and her symptoms, I'm concerned about possible sacral fractures, iliac fractures, or pubic rami fractures. These can be very difficult to see on standard x-rays, especially in the acute phase." "Are those serious?" "Pelvic fractures are always serious, but the specific location and extent determine the treatment approach. Some heal well with conservative management, while others require surgical intervention." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Surgical intervention?" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Dr. Torres said diplomatically. "First, we need to see exactly what we're dealing with. I'm ordering a CT scan with contrast, which will give us much more detailed images than x-rays." "How long will that take?" Dad asked, checking his watch again. "The scan itself takes about 30 minutes. Results interpretation might take an hour or two, depending on the radiologist's schedule." "And then what?" "Then we'll know what we're treating, and I'll consult with orthopedics about the best approach." As I was wheeled down to the radiology department, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. Anxiety about what the scan might reveal, but relief that finally, someone was taking my symptoms seriously enough to investigate thoroughly. The CT scanner was an imposing machine, but the radiology technician, a cheerful woman named Sarah, explained everything that would happen and made sure I was as comfortable as possible given my pain level.
Try to stay as still as you can, she instructed as the table slid into the machine. I know it's difficult when you're hurting, but the clearer the images, the better we can help you. The scan took exactly 32 minutes. 32 minutes during which I lay perfectly still while powerful X-ray beams created detailed cross-sectional images of my pelvis, revealing whatever Natalie's shove had actually caused. When I was wheeled back to my emergency room bed, Dr. Torres was waiting with a tablet computer and an expression that told me the results were significant. "The good news is that we have answers," she said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "The concerning news is that your instincts about the severity of your injury were absolutely correct." She turned the tablet so I could see the scan images, pointing to areas that looked like broken puzzle pieces to my untrained eye. "You have multiple pelvic fractures, specifically bilateral pubic rami fractures, a left iliac wing fracture, and a small sacral fracture. These are significant injuries that have clearly been healing improperly for the past 2 weeks." The room went completely silent. Dad's face had gone pale, and Mom was staring at the scan images with obvious shock. "Multiple fractures?" Dad repeated weakly. "Yes, and what's particularly concerning is that the displacement has increased since the time of injury, which suggests that continued activity without proper immobilization has made the fractures worse." "But the X-rays," Dad started. "X-rays miss approximately 30% of pelvic fractures, especially in the acute phase, when swelling and positioning can obscure fracture lines. That's why I always recommend advanced imaging for significant pelvic trauma."
Dr. Torres swiped to another image, showing a different angle of the same fractures. This level of injury explains why Harmony has been in such severe pain. Pelvic fractures are among the most painful orthopedic injuries, and walking around with untreated fractures for 2 weeks would be absolutely excruciating. I felt vindicated and horrified in equal measure. Vindicated because my pain was real and serious, exactly as I'd been insisting. Horrified because 2 weeks of agony could have been avoided if my family had prioritized proper medical care over Natalie's race preparation. "What happens now?" Mom asked. "I'm consulting with Dr. James Mitchell, our orthopedic trauma specialist. Based on the extent and displacement of these fractures, Harmony is going to need hospitalization and possibly surgical intervention." "Surgery?" Dad's voice cracked. "The pubic rami fractures might heal with conservative treatment, but the iliac wing fracture has significant displacement that may require internal fixation. Dr. Mitchell will make that determination." "How long would hospitalization be?" Dad asked. "For this type of injury, typically 4 to 7 days, followed by several weeks of limited mobility and physical therapy." I watched Dad calculate the timeline in his head. Natalie's race was in 2 days. If I was hospitalized for a week, that would carry us well past her competition and into the potential celebration or disappointment period that would follow. "Doctor," Dad said carefully, "is it possible to delay treatment until next week? My other daughter has an important athletic competition, and family stress could affect her performance." Dr. Torres stared at Dad for a long moment, and I could see her professional composure being tested. "Mr. Patterson, your daughter has been walking around with multiple pelvic fractures for 2 weeks. The fractures have displaced further during that time, which means the injury is getting worse, not better. Delaying orthopedic intervention could result in permanent mobility issues or chronic pain." "But if we waited just a few more days—" "No." Dr. Torres's voice was firm. "This is not a discretionary timeline. Harmony needs immediate orthopedic evaluation and treatment." "Dad," I said quietly, "please stop trying to delay my medical care." "I'm not trying to delay your medical care. I'm trying to balance the needs of both my daughters." "One of your daughters has multiple fractures and needs surgery. The other daughter has a ski race. How is that balance even a question?" Before Dad could respond, there was a knock on the door.
A tall man in scrubs entered, introducing himself as Dr. Mitchell. "I've reviewed Harmony's CT scan," he said, after shaking hands with my parents. "These are significant injuries that require immediate attention." Dr. Mitchell pulled up the scan images on the room's computer monitor, pointing out each fracture with clinical precision. The bilateral pubic rami fractures are stable but displaced. The left iliac wing fracture has significant displacement with potential for further migration. The sacral fracture is minor but adds to the overall instability of the pelvic ring. "What does that mean for treatment?" Mom asked. "The iliac wing fracture requires surgical reduction and internal fixation. Essentially, we need to realign the bone fragments and secure them with plates and screws. The pubic rami fractures should heal with conservative treatment once the pelvis is stabilized." "When would surgery happen?" I asked. "Today. This afternoon, if possible. The longer we wait, the more difficult the reduction becomes as the bones begin to heal in their displaced positions." Dad's shoulders sagged. The reality that his daughter needed emergency surgery was finally penetrating his focus on Natalie's athletic schedule. "What's the recovery timeline?" he asked. 6 to 8 weeks of limited mobility, followed by several months of physical therapy. Harmony will be on crutches or a walker for at least 6 weeks, with gradual return to full activity over 3 to 4 months. The scope of my injury and recovery was sinking in for all of us. This wasn't a minor setback that would resolve quickly. This was a major medical event that would affect my life for months. "Dr. Mitchell," Mom said, "could this injury have been treated more effectively if it had been properly diagnosed initially?" Absolutely. Early identification and immobilization would have prevented the displacement we're seeing now. While the fractures still would have required surgical intervention, the procedure would have been simpler and the recovery potentially shorter. So the 2-week delay made things worse? Significantly worse, yes. I could see Dad processing this information, finally understanding that his insistence on delaying proper medical care had directly contributed to the severity of my current situation. "I want to understand something," I said, looking directly at Dad. "You keep saying you're trying to balance both daughters' needs, but when exactly during the past 2 weeks did Natalie's race become more important than my being able to walk without fractures? Harmony, that's not fair. When did her mental preparation become more valuable than my physical well-being? You're oversimplifying a complex situation. No, I'm asking a simple question. At what point did you decide that my pain was acceptable collateral damage for Natalie's athletic success?" Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Torres exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out in front of them. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to give you some time to discuss this as a family, but I need to emphasize that Harmony's surgery cannot be delayed further. I've scheduled her for the operating room at 2 p.m. today." After the doctors left, the three of us sat in awkward silence. The weight of the medical evidence had made it impossible to continue dismissing my injury as minor or manageable. "Harmony," Dad said finally, "I never meant for things to get this serious. But they did get this serious. And every time I told you something was wrong, you found reasons to minimize it or delay treatment. I believed you were exaggerating because of the timing with Natalie's race."
So you assumed I was lying about my pain to sabotage my sister? Not lying, but maybe unconsciously amplifying symptoms because you felt overlooked? The casual psychological analysis of my pain, the suggestion that I had somehow manifested multiple pelvic fractures through emotional neediness, was breathtaking in its dismissiveness. "Dad, look at those scan images. Look at the fractures. Do you think I unconsciously created those to get attention?" For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Dad seemed to genuinely consider the implications of what he'd been saying and doing. "No," he said quietly, "I can see that your injury is real and serious." "It was always real and serious. The only thing that's changed is that now you have medical evidence you can't dismiss." "You're right. I should have listened to you sooner." You should have listened to me 2 weeks ago. You should have listened to Dr. Martinez when he recommended additional testing. You should have listened to Mom when she said something was wrong. I know. I made mistakes in judgment. You made choices. You chose to prioritize Natalie's race schedule over my medical needs, and now I need surgery that might have been preventable. The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message. It was from Natalie. Dad told me about your surgery. I'm so sorry this happened. I'm coming to the hospital. She's coming here? Dad asked, reading over my shoulder. She shouldn't be traveling right now. She needs to stay focused on her race preparation. Maybe it's time to stop managing everyone's emotional state and just deal with reality. Natalie pushed me into a bed frame and fractured my pelvis. I need surgery. These are facts, not inconveniences to be managed. An hour later, Natalie arrived at the hospital with red eyes and obvious anxiety. She'd driven herself, which meant that she'd left the house against Dad's explicit instructions about maintaining her pre-race routine. Harmony, I'm so sorry, she said, immediately starting to cry when she saw me in the hospital bed. I had no idea it was this serious. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, I replied. Accidents happen. But I should have insisted that you get proper medical care right away. I knew you were in real pain, and I let Dad convince everyone that my race was more important. You're not responsible for Dad's decisions about my medical care. But I benefited from those decisions. I got all the attention and resources while you suffered with untreated fractures. Natalie's acknowledgement of the family dynamics was more direct than anything I'd heard from my parents. She was taking responsibility not just for the initial injury, but for the system that had prioritized her needs over my well-being. What are you going to do about your race? I asked. I'm withdrawing, she said simply. Natalie, no, Dad protested. You don't need to do that. Yes, I do. I can't race knowing that my sister is having surgery because the family was too focused on my athletic career to get her proper medical care. But this is your chance for Olympic development team recognition. Dad, stop. Natalie's voice was firm. There will be other races. Harmony only has one pelvis, and we almost let it heal wrong because of my skiing career. You're making an emotional decision that you'll regret later. I'm making a moral decision that I should have made 2 weeks ago. Watching Natalie choose my well-being over her athletic ambitions was transformative, not because I needed her sacrifice, but because it demonstrated that someone in my family was capable of prioritizing appropriately when faced with clear evidence of harm. As I was prepared for surgery that afternoon, I reflected on how drastically my understanding of family loyalty had shifted. Real loyalty wasn't protecting someone from the consequences of their actions or enabling harmful priorities. Real loyalty was facing uncomfortable truths and making difficult choices to prevent further harm. The radiologist who would later review my post-surgical images, Dr. Andra Foster, would become an unexpected advocate whose professional integrity would help me understand the full scope of what had happened and what I deserved going forward. But first, I had to survive surgery to repair fractures that never should have been allowed to worsen in the first place. The surgery took 4 hours. Dr. Mitchell had warned us it might be complicated due to the 2-week delay in treatment, but even he seemed surprised by what he found once he could see the fractures directly. I woke up in the recovery room with my leg immobilized in a complex brace system and pain medication flowing through an IV that made everything feel distant and hazy. Mom was sitting beside my bed, and for the first time in weeks, her attention was focused entirely on me rather than divided between my needs and Natalie's schedule. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Different," I said, and I meant it in more ways than just the physical. The pain was still there, but it was the clean pain of surgical repair rather than the grinding agony of displaced fractures. More importantly, I felt the psychological relief of finally being taken seriously by medical professionals who understood the severity of what I'd been enduring. Dr. Mitchell appeared in my recovery bay about an hour later, still in his surgical scrubs, looking tired but satisfied. "The surgery went well," he told my parents, though it was more complicated than I had hoped.
The displacement was significant, and there was already some early malunion where the bones had begun to heal incorrectly. Malunion? Mom asked. When fractures heal in the wrong position, we had to re-break some areas that had started to heal improperly before we could realign everything correctly. Dad winced at the description. So the delay did make it more complicated? Substantially. If we'd caught this within the first few days, it would have been a much simpler procedure with better long-term outcomes.
What kind of long-term outcomes are we looking at now? I asked. With proper rehabilitation, you should regain full mobility and strength, but you'll likely have some ongoing stiffness, and there's a higher risk of arthritis in the affected joints later in life. Dr. Mitchell pulled up post-surgical x-rays on the room's computer monitor, showing the hardware that had been implanted to hold my pelvis together. We used titanium plates and screws to stabilize the iliac wing fracture and reinforce the pubic rami. These will stay in permanently unless they cause problems later. I stared at the images of my reconstructed pelvis, metal hardware clearly visible against the bone. It was sobering to see the extent of surgical intervention that had been required to fix what Natalie's moment of anger had broken. The important thing now is proper rehabilitation, Dr. Mitchell continued. You'll be non-weight-bearing for 6 weeks, then gradual return to activity over several months. Physical therapy will be crucial. When can she go home? Dad asked. Probably in 3 or 4 days, once we're sure there are no complications and her pain is manageable with oral medications. That evening, after my parents had gone home to rest, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Amanda Foster, the radiologist who had interpreted my CT scan, knocked on my door around 8 p.m. Hi, Harmony. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to check on how you're doing after surgery. Dr. Foster was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with an intensity that suggested she took her work personally. I don't mind at all. Thank you for coming. She pulled up a chair beside my bed. I've been thinking about your case since I read your scans this morning. Specifically, I've been thinking about the timeline and the delay in diagnosis. What about it? Harmony, I've been a radiologist for 8 years. I've seen thousands of trauma cases. Your injury pattern was classic for high-energy pelvic trauma, the kind of fractures I typically see from car accidents or falls from significant heights. But I just fell into a bed frame. You fell into a bed frame after being shoved with considerable force by someone much larger than you. The mechanism of injury was sufficient to cause serious fractures, and the symptoms you described should have warranted immediate advanced imaging. I wasn't sure where she was going with this conversation, but her professional focus was comforting after weeks of having my symptoms minimized. Dr. Foster, can I ask you something? Of course. The x-rays from 2 weeks ago, would you have been able to see the fractures on those images? She paused, choosing her words carefully. That's an interesting question. Would you mind if I looked at those original films? I don't mind, but why? Because I'm curious about whether this was truly a case of fractures that were difficult to visualize, or whether there might be other factors involved. The next morning, Dr. Foster returned with a tablet computer and a serious expression. Harmony, I've reviewed your original x-rays from the urgent care visit. I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. What is it? The fractures were visible on those initial images. Not all of them, but the iliac wing fracture was clearly present, and there were strong indications of the pubic rami fractures. I felt my stomach drop. They were visible? Yes, any radiologist with standard training should have identified at least the major fracture and recommended immediate orthopedic consultation. But the report said possible hairline fractures and recommended follow-up only if symptoms worsened. I know, I've read that report, and frankly, it represents a significant diagnostic error. The implications of what Dr. Foster was telling me slowly sank in.
Not only had my family dismissed my pain and delayed treatment, but the medical system had also failed me through misdiagnosis. What does that mean? It means your 2 weeks of suffering and the complications from your surgery were potentially preventable. If the fractures had been properly identified initially, you would have received appropriate treatment immediately. Can diagnostic errors like this be reported? They can. And in cases where delayed diagnosis leads to increased morbidity, which yours clearly did, they should be. Dr. Foster explained the process for reporting diagnostic errors and the potential implications for the radiologist who had missed my fractures. But more importantly, she offered to help me document everything that had happened. Harmony, I want you to understand something. You advocated for yourself appropriately throughout this process. You described your symptoms accurately, you sought medical attention when necessary, and you persisted when others tried to dismiss your concerns. The failures were not yours. It doesn't feel that way. I keep thinking I should have been more insistent or found a way to get better care sooner. You were 17 years old with a serious injury, dealing with family members who prioritized other concerns over your well-being, and medical professionals who failed to diagnose you properly. You did everything right. Dr. Foster's validation was transformative. For weeks, I'd been made to feel like my pain was an inconvenience, my need for medical care was unreasonable, and my insistence that something was seriously wrong was dramatic overreaction. Having a medical professional confirm that my instincts had been correct and my advocacy appropriate was healing in ways that went beyond the physical. Dr. Foster, can I ask you why you're taking such an interest in my case? Because I believe patients deserve accurate diagnosis and appropriate care, regardless of their age or family circumstances. And because I've seen too many cases where young women's pain is dismissed or minimized in ways that wouldn't happen to other patients. What do you mean? There's substantial research showing that women, particularly young women, are more likely to have their pain minimized, their symptoms attributed to emotional causes, and their requests for medical care dismissed as attention-seeking. Your case is a textbook example of how these biases can lead to serious medical consequences.
Over the next 2 days, as I recovered in the hospital, Dr. Foster helped me understand not just what had happened medically, but why it had happened systematically. She explained how implicit bias in healthcare affects diagnosis and treatment, how family dynamics can interfere with appropriate medical care, and how patients can advocate for themselves more effectively. The most important thing, she told me during one of our conversations, is that you learn to trust your own experience of your body. You knew something was seriously wrong, and you were right. Don't let anyone convince you to doubt that kind of self-knowledge. When my parents visited that afternoon, I had a very different conversation with them than any we'd had during this entire ordeal. "I need to tell you both something," I said when they were settled in chairs beside my bed. "I've learned some things about my diagnosis and treatment that I think you should know." "What kind of things?" Mom asked. "The radiologist who interpreted my original x-rays missed fractures that were clearly visible. Dr. Foster reviewed the films and confirmed that my fracture should have been diagnosed 2 weeks ago." Dad's face went pale. "You mean the urgent care doctor was wrong about the images being inconclusive?" "Not the urgent care doctor, the radiologist who read the x-rays. Dr. Martinez was working with a report that said possible hairline fractures when the images actually showed definitive fractures requiring immediate treatment." "So, if the radiologist had read the x-rays correctly," Mom started, "I would have been properly diagnosed and treated 2 weeks ago. The surgery would have been simpler, my recovery would be shorter, and I wouldn't have the increased risk of complications." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Not only had our family's priorities been wrong, but the medical system had also failed in ways that compounded the harm. "Harmony," Dad said finally, "I owe you an enormous apology." "Yes, you do. I was so focused on protecting Natalie's opportunity that I convinced myself your injury wasn't serious. Even when you told me repeatedly that something was wrong, I found reasons to dismiss your concerns.
You didn't just dismiss my concerns, Dad. You suggested I was exaggerating or fabricating symptoms for attention. You made me doubt my own experience of pain. I know, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the harm I caused. What about Natalie's race? Are you disappointed that she withdrew? Dad was quiet for a long moment. I'm disappointed that I created a family environment where my daughter felt she had to choose between her athletic goals and my sister's medical needs. That choice should never have existed. But are you disappointed she chose me? No, I'm proud of her for recognizing what mattered most when I couldn't see it clearly. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from Dad throughout this entire experience. What happens now? Mom asked. Now I recover. I do physical therapy. I learned to walk without fractures for the first time in 2 weeks. And with the family? I'd been thinking about this question since Dr. Foster had first explained how various systems had failed me. My family's prioritization of Natalie's athletic career over my medical needs wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It was a reflection of values that had caused real harm. I'm going to finish high school and go to college somewhere far from Cedar Ridge. I'm going to study something that helps people advocate for themselves when systems fail them. You're leaving? Mom asked. I'm growing up, and I'm choosing to surround myself with people who value my well-being as much as they value other people's achievements. Does that mean you're cutting contact with the family? It means I'm establishing boundaries. You've all shown me that when priorities conflict, my health and safety rank lower than athletic opportunities. I can't count on you to protect me when it matters most. Dad started to protest, but I held up my hand. Dad, 2 weeks ago, I was lying on my bedroom floor with multiple pelvic fractures, and your primary concern was avoiding distractions from Natalie's race. If that's not a fundamental failure of parental responsibility, I don't know what is. People make mistakes. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of choices that prioritized one daughter's wants over another daughter's needs. The fact that I needed surgery to fix fractures that could have been treated conservatively 2 weeks ago isn't a mistake. It's a consequence of those choices. The conversation was interrupted by Natalie arriving with flowers and a card. She looked tired and subdued, clearly struggling with guilt over both the injury she had caused and the family dynamics that had made it worse. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the flowers on my bedside table. "Better. The surgery was successful, and I'm starting to understand how everything went wrong. I keep thinking about how different things would be if I hadn't lost my temper that day. Natalie, the initial injury was an accident. What happened afterward, the delay in treatment, the dismissal of my symptoms, that wasn't about your moment of anger. That was about family priorities that were already broken. But if I hadn't hurt you in the first place, then maybe we never would have discovered how our family handles medical emergencies. Maybe I would have learned about these dynamics when the stakes were even higher." Natalie looked confused, so I explained what Dr. Foster had taught me about implicit bias, medical advocacy, and the importance of trusting your own experience of your body. The injury you caused was unfortunate, but it also revealed systems, both family and medical, that were already problematic. In some ways, learning about these failures now gives me tools to navigate them better in the future.
3 months later, I was walking without assistance and had been accepted to several universities with strong social work programs. My physical therapy was progressing well, though I would indeed have some ongoing stiffness and increased arthritis risk, as Dr. Mitchell had predicted. More importantly, my understanding of advocacy, boundaries, and self-worth had been fundamentally transformed. Dr. Foster had introduced me to literature about medical advocacy and patient rights, and I'd decided to focus my college studies on healthcare policy and patient advocacy. Natalie had resumed skiing, but with a different relationship to competition. She was still talented and motivated, but she'd started working with a sports psychologist to address the pressure and anger that had contributed to her violent outburst. Her athletic goals were now balanced with other priorities, including maintaining healthy family relationships. Dad had started individual therapy to address what he called his tunnel vision around athletic achievement. He was working to understand how his coaching mentality had infiltrated his parenting in harmful ways. The family dynamics were slowly improving, but I maintained the boundaries I'd established in the hospital. I lived with a host family during my senior year of high school, visited home occasionally, and kept conversations focused on topics that didn't trigger old patterns of prioritization. Dr. Foster became an unexpected mentor, helping me understand healthcare systems and encouraging my interest in patient advocacy. She also followed through on reporting the diagnostic error that had delayed my treatment, leading to additional training for the radiologist involved and policy changes at the urgent care clinic. Looking back, I realized that my transformation hadn't begun with the surgery or even with Dr. Foster's advocacy. It had begun the moment I decided to trust my own experience of pain over my family's assessment of its importance. The girl who had once minimized her own suffering to avoid inconveniencing others had become a young woman who understood that self-advocacy wasn't selfish. It was essential. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who've harmed you is to establish boundaries that prevent them from causing similar harm in the future. My pelvis healed stronger than it had been before the fractures, reinforced with titanium hardware that would last a lifetime. My sense of self-worth had undergone a similar reconstruction, reinforced with the understanding that my well-being mattered regardless of how it affected other people's priorities. And Dr. Amanda Foster had shown me that sometimes the most powerful form of advocacy comes from professionals who refuse to accept systemic failures as inevitable, who use their expertise and authority to validate experiences that others have dismissed. She didn't just read my scans correctly. She taught me to read the systems around me with the same clarity and insist on the accuracy I deserved.